When I was 29 years old, in January of 2000, my mother unfortunately died in an accident down in Costa Rica. She drowned on a river that they really shouldn't have been on. It was swollen with rains, and the company that they had gone with already had a lot of safety violations. And I've talked about this in another video, so I'm not going to go into the details of her death or grieving or the funeral and all the other stuff that was associated with it. One of the things that I was thinking about lately, because I was taking a drive down to Indiana, and I was thinking about this actually as I was going through Chicago and seeing the turn for Highway 57, Interstate Highway 57, which goes all the way down to, well, it goes down to Carbondale, Illinois, and then goes well past it as well. But that was where I would take it to, was the drives that I had to take going back and forth between the Milwaukee area, specifically the suburb of Brookfield, where my mother had recently purchased a house. She'd moved from Menominee Falls, where she'd been living for about 10 years or so, to Brookfield, into a different house, a newer house, a nicer house in a kind of ritzy subdivision. And of course, it was mortgaged to the hilt. She had bought it with some proceeds and put a down payment, and then it was, when we sold it, we basically didn't make any money. But in order to handle her estate, we had to meet with these lawyers, and they were also in Brookfield. And when I say we, I mean myself and my sister, who was pregnant at the time and really kind of a mess. And she had a fiance who she did later marry, of course, and then, had a child with and would divorce later. And I had a girlfriend at the time as well in graduate school. And so for a little while, it was all of us putting our heads together, and I had some support from family as well who'd shown up, and, but most of the long-term stuff having to do with being an executor of the estate fell to me. And so I was down in Carbondale, Illinois at the time, at Southern Illinois University, Carbondale. I was in graduate school. And as a matter of fact, I would have been in my PhD program. I was just getting to teach one of my own classes that was at a higher level. I'd taught 2 ethics classes prior to that, and now I was teaching philosophy of politics, law, and justice, which was kind of a big deal, and getting ready to start eventually working on my dissertation. And then my mom dies. And there are myriad details that have to be handled in terms of an estate. And sometimes you might hear of the death tax or the estate tax. Well, because she owned this house, which was quite valuable, but which was largely debt, she was across the line, just across the line, for having to file estate tax, right? And she wouldn't actually have to pay any, but she had to file, or her estate had to file. So that meant I had to go up and meet with these lawyers. For a while it was like once every 2 or 3 weeks. We had to sell the house. We had to do all sorts of things, consolidate bank accounts. There was lots and lots and lots of business to handle and to transact. And, I wasn't particularly experienced in this sort of thing. And I was dealing with the grief and school and all of these sort of matters. In any case, I would have to make this drive in order to get up there from Carbondale all the way up through Chicago to Milwaukee and then to Brookfield, and then, be there for a certain amount of time and then drive back down again. And it's that drive that I was thinking about and I wanted to tell you about. And some of this is going to be geographical, and some of it is going to be just memories of things and, sort of reminiscing about it. And do remember that we're talking about a time more than 20 years ago. So, cars are different now. The ways in which we go about things is quite different now. And, some of this will be like back in my day, but a lot of it might be of interest to people. So, if you look at the map to go from Carbondale, Illinois, up to Brookfield, Wisconsin, if you make really, really good time, maybe a 7-hour trip. It could take you longer depending on if you get caught in traffic jams. You can't really easily avoid going through Chicago. I mean, you could take alternate routes, but then you would be on much slower highways that are not the interstate and that go, roughly up the central part of Illinois, stopping everywhere. That would take even longer. So, you would get on the road and cut across going east until you hit Highway 57. And then it's a long, long drive up 57 to get to Chicago. And so, you'd hit various towns along the way where you could stop and get gas or get something to eat or pick up a snack or just get out and stretch your legs. But, once you got out of southern Illinois, 57, it's one of those roads. There's many roads like this in the United States. It's one of those roads that's kind of boring, right? It's fairly flat in much of central and northern Illinois. Lots and lots of fields, but you've seen one field, you kind of seen most of them. I won't say that you've seen all of them. And so you get on the road and you would anticipate, all right, I'm going to have to go for a while. And it's a long, long drive, so it's not, you're not looking forward to spending, any more time than you have to on the road. I should preface something, too. I had a car. So before my mother died, I'd had a car before when I was in undergraduate, and then shortly after coming here to Milwaukee, I was in a terrible accident. It got totaled. And then I didn't have another car until after my mother died, and she had a Chrysler Sebring convertible, which she'd, recently purchased. And it wasn't a bad car. It was kind of sporty, pretty fast, a lot of good pickup to it. Being a convertible wasn't great because a lot of the driving I was doing was in the winter time, so it could get kind of chilly at times. And since I had to take care of the estate, and we knew where I was going to be, traversing back and forth, and it was part of the estate, my sister and I and the lawyers decided I would get that. Later on, actually, my sister and I would swap cars after the estate was being handled because she wanted the Sebring, but I had it as a resource for these long drives. So anyway, I get in the Sebring, get on 57, start heading north, and now it's acres and acres of cornfield broken up by exits here and there and places where you could turn off. And I actually knew the route already pretty well because since I didn't have a car, before, my mother died, if I wanted to come up here to Milwaukee for, vacations, or I actually had a girlfriend here in Milwaukee for a while, I would take the Greyhound bus. And the Greyhound bus takes exactly the same route, but not quite so quick. And it stops all sorts of places. Actually, the very first stop for the Greyhound bus after Carbondale is Marion. If you know anything about that town, it's mostly associated with the federal prison, which is there where, for example, John Gotti was kept. And, you'd always have a couple prisoners who are on furlough getting on the bus, usually getting themselves in trouble, getting kicked off the bus by the time that we got up to, say, Effingham. The bus would pull over and the state troopers would come and pull them off. So I was pretty accustomed to this route. And I would just get on the road and, I would make sure I was gassed up. If it was bad weather, I'd try to make sure the windshields were as clear as possible. One of the things you do when you stop at a gas station is you clean your windows, right? You get in, you dip into that slosh that they have, which might be wiper fluid or it might just be water. It might be who knows what. Sometimes it smells a little off and you rub it across your windows and then use the squeegee to clean it off. And, you just do all these sorts of things. You gas up, get some snacks, like beef jerky or candy bars or something like that. Get yourself a coffee, maybe get yourself a Coke, some water, and then you head out. And you try to make as many miles as you can before you have to stop again. And, sometimes it can be interesting to see what's going on. If you've got a fast car, you can pass people up. You got to watch out for the cops, of course. You don't want to get pulled over and get a ticket because that's expensive, and it also cuts into your time. But, you find some every once in a while, there'd actually be like other people that were into, making good time, and you follow them. You can tell that they're, passing at the right time, and you'd be almost like a little convoy. And one of the things that I would do that would help me, kill the time was to listen to the radio. And so, you'd listen to radio stations and they'd play different kinds of music, or you listen to some NPR, some National Public Radio, and they'd have interesting shows, or, you flip to the AM band and you might hear something that could be kind of interesting depending on the time of day or night. And I would do some of this driving at night, in fact. Now that I recall, it wasn't always during the bright lights of the day or the overcast, rainy sky. Sometimes I would get on the road at night because I knew that was the best time to make good time on the road. But then you get tired, you get a little punchy, you got to listen to stuff to help keep your mind active. But the car also had a CD player, and this is back when it was quite common to listen to our music on compact discs. This is before, well, I think there are probably some, MP3 players out there at the time, but I didn't have that sort of technology, and so compact discs were the way to go. And, I was listening to a wide variety of stuff. I remember, for example, listening to The Offspring because I had a few of their CDs, and I also remember listening to Blood, Sweat, and Tears. I had a CD of them, and every once in a while I was already kind of emotional, and some of the songs would remind me of my dad, who had passed away years and years and years before that, when I was only 11. And I'd listen to other things as well. I had kind of a nice CD collection, so a lot of grunge stuff at the time, some metal stuff, some alternative stuff, some folk, and whatever you want to call that 1970s mix of different genres of music that we'd listen to. And you put a CD in, and that would help the miles go away. And sometimes you had to watch out for zoning out. You would be listening to something and your eyes are kind of looking at what you're doing, and your muscle memory of the car is handling things, and suddenly you realize you've gone 50 miles and you can't remember any of it. That's a little scary when that happens. So anyway, you've got this long stretch of 57 that's a bit boring. You just want to try to get through it as much as possible. And then you start getting to the outskirts of what we call Chicagoland, right? Chicago is a major metropolitan area in the United States. It's the biggest city in the Midwest, and it's vast, and it's unavoidable, too, if you're trying to get to the Milwaukee area, unless you want to do a real detour around. So the only ways through Chicago are to make it through, and there's various routes that you can take with the interstate. I would typically take Interstate 94 or this Loop 294 that goes out around the suburbs. It's a bypass. At that time, it didn't really make sense for me to try to take the Skyway 90, although the Skyway is pretty cool. And all of these, Illinois has tolls, right? So you got to pay money, especially if you're on 294. And this is before like Easy Pass or iPass or any of these electronic things. You actually had to have money, like physical money, that you could either like hand to somebody in the toll booth and then they'd give you change back, or you had to have change and you throw it into this bucket and it would get all, tabulated, it'd fall down in there, and like computers would chart it, and then it would like lift the toll thing, and then you could get on your way. And that would slow you down a good bit. Nowadays with, all these electronic things, you can just like roll through. That wasn't the case in the past. And that's what we grew up with, and that's just the way it was. So anyway, you start rolling in, and you get to these places like, Kankakee and Joliet. You're making your way through on Highway 57. Then eventually you get to where 57 intersects with 80-94. And now, you try to make as good time as you can. And you're zooming through this city. Oftentimes I would start like in the afternoon, and I'd be hitting Chicago at night. Everything would be dark except for all the lights everywhere. And there were, sometimes traffic jams. Sometimes you'd make it through okay. And if you were making it through okay, one of the peculiarities of Chicago traffic at that time, and still going on to the present, is, within the city limits, even on the interstate, your speed limit is 55 miles an hour. That's not how Chicago people drive. If you're on the interstate and traffic is moving smoothly, you're going about 80 miles an hour. If you're driving 70, which is way over the speed limit, you have people passing you constantly. Some of them going 90 miles an hour, right? And it's not just the cars. Even the trucks, the big semis, are barreling through. And they do this in construction zones. They do this everywhere else. There's always construction zones on the interstate in Chicago as well. So you make it up through Chicago. You're on the south side. Maybe if you take 294, you go through the suburbs, and then you pass O'Hare, and now you're on the north side. If you're taking 94, you go through the loop, and then you make it all the way up to the point where you need to be, and then you're on the north side, and you start seeing these different oases that you can stop at, and it's a lot more exciting being in Chicago. But by that time, you're getting pretty fatigued, right? You've been driving for at least 5 hours. And so then, you make it through, and now you're on the way to Wisconsin. And things start getting a little bit, sparser. There's certain roads, like, that I remember passing all the time. Tui, for example. There was a girl who I went to college with who had that last name, and I always wondered if she was like, somehow associated with that. You get these idle thoughts going through your head. And then suddenly you're past Waukegan, and you're hitting the state border, and now you're on your way to Milwaukee, and you pass Kenosha, and you pass Racine, and the exits for them, maybe you stop there, and then you get to Milwaukee. And then taking Milwaukee, 94 swings way out, it would go all the way past Madison and to the edge of the state. I only had to go a short way after that to get off in Brookfield, and then make my way, maybe 10 minutes to the subdivision where my mom had her house. And then I would stay there for however long I needed to while I did things with the lawyers and, catch up with a few of my friends who were still in town. And then I would have to get back on the road and do the whole thing in reverse. And I do want to mention one other thing about that. So, you get yourself out of Milwaukee, go down through Chicago. Now you're pretty fresh as you're doing that, right? And oftentimes, like I said, I would do that in the middle of the night so that I could avoid the traffic in Chicago. But now you've got that long stretch of 57 ahead of you. The boring, flat, nothing really there stretch until you get into southern Illinois and you start having hills and more interesting terrain, and then you're on your way back home. And I will mention this to bring this to a close. So, it was a rough time in my life. I'd lost my mom. My dad was long gone. A lot of grieving going on, a lot of processing of feelings. I was in graduate school, so I had a lot on my mind with that as well. What am I going to do for my dissertation? And one of the comforts that I would take was finding places that I did want to stop, not just to get gas, but for a decent meal. And I don't remember where this was along 57, what exit, what town, but there was a small little town, and they had a A-frame restaurant, the sort of high roof kind of construction. And it was called Amish something, but I don't think there were any Amish people involved. It was just sort of a selling point. And I stopped there enough times that the wait staff got to, recognize me when I'd come in, and I'd have like a book that I was going to read, and I would sit there and I would get a Coke, a water, a patty melt, fries, and chili. And occasionally I'd get dessert, but most of the time not, right? Depending on what they had, if they had a good pie or something. And I would sit there and, kind of decompress from the road and dip my fries into the chili, which is one of the ways I like to have that stuff, and eat that, have the patty melt, which is, rye bread with a patty and cheese and onions on top of that. And I would just sort of like, sometimes I wouldn't even read the book. I would just sort of like think to myself about what I was doing and what was going on, and just sort of process. I wasn't rolling, anymore. I mean, some of these drives, you get to the point with these older cars where even after you get out, you feel like you're still moving. You feel like you're still bouncing around a little bit. And that's what I would feel as I was doing that. I don't remember exactly where that was. Like I said, it was about 2 hours from Carbondale, so it was a convenient spot for me to stop on the way down, not generally on the way up. But I don't know how many times I made those trips, but it certainly was a lot. And, how many hours, how many days did I spend on the road doing that? I don't have a clue. But it happened. It was a significant part of what I had to go through. And I was just reminded of that, like I said, this last weekend when I drove down to Indiana and I was on 94 and I saw the turnoff for 57, and I thought to myself, thank goodness I don't have to do that anymore. So that's the story of that long, lonely trek that I had to do over and over and over again for about close to a year, maybe even a year and a half.